I've been studying the story of Abraham. He starts out as Abram, by the way, A-B-R-A-M. So he has a different name, which is actually relevant as the story progresses. So Abraham has privilege in the modern parlance. He's got rich parents, and everything he needs is right at hand for him. I mean, it begs the question, of course, what is it that you actually need? But what Abram has is kind of like he's got the materialist paradise at hand. There's nothing that he doesn't have at hand whose absence would cause privation. So I would say he's a fully satiated infant. And you can think about that as a notion of utopia. It's the notion of utopia that Dostoevsky criticized, by the way. And what happens to Abraham, he's like 75, and the Spirit of God comes to him. That's how the story lays itself out, and says, look, buddy, you got to get the hell out of your zone of comfort. You have to leave your father's tent. You have to leave your people. You have to leave everything that's made you comfortable, and you have to journey out into the world. And Abram agrees to this deal. Okay, so as soon as he agrees that he's going to forego his infantile comfort, even though he's like 70 by this time, so he's a bit of a late bloomer, God offers him a deal. This is the covenant. And so I think it's a description of the consequences of the full manifestation of the spirit of adventure. So imagine that there's a spirit within you that calls you to a more profound level of development. It's the spirit that you would encourage if you had any sense, if you had in your children, if you had children. You're launching them into the world. You're saying, follow the spirit of adventure. Okay, so God offers Abraham a deal. He says, if you do this and you make the necessary sacrifices, then you'll live a life that will be a blessing to you. That will happen in a manner that will redound to your reputation. So you'll become known, but in a way that, in the right way to become known, you'll become influential and admirable in the proper manner as a consequence of undertaking the adventure. You'll do that in a way that will establish something permanent. So that's a dynasty with innumerable descendants because of the pattern that you're establishing. And you'll do all of that in a way that's maximally beneficial to everyone else. So the case is being made in that story that there's no difference between the direction that the spirit of adventure orients you and the provision of plenty psychologically, socially, and over the longest possible span of time. And that's the covenant. And so the notion would be that, and this is what is portrayed to Abraham, is that there's no better possible way of conducting yourself psychologically or socially, all things considered, while in this story, than following this voice that calls you out into the world. Now, when Abram does go into the world, all hell breaks loose, right? He encounters famine and tyranny and war and that calls on him to become increasingly more than he is. Every time he has a new field of adventure that reveals itself in front of him, he's called upon to make a sacrifice. He has to change. He has to let go. He has to abandon the parts of him that are no longer appropriate to the new situation. And he does that intensely, so intensely that he is eventually rewarded with a new name, which is Abraham, instead of Abram. He becomes a new person. It's a good way of thinking about it. So, and then, well, obviously Abraham is called upon to make an ultimate sacrifice, which is the sacrifice of his son, Isaac. And that's part and parcel of the notion that everything that you have is to be offered up to the thing that's highest that pulls you forward. It's something, and that's what God is. That's part and parcel of the story. It's a definition of what's to be put in the highest place. That's a contract.
I get it. I like the mirroring of Abraham's sacrifice in the Old Testament and the sacrifice of Christ as the apex event in the New Testament, that there is an inversion of that principle. I enjoy too the idea that the endowment of spirit and the spirit of adventure is the maximal principle of a great father. I enjoy this idea very much as well. And I was wondering, Jordan, whilst you were speaking about the values that may entail, because a little earlier when you were talking about money being sort of one of the establishing principles for community and the way that values can be maintained and community can be maintained, and you said it's an expression of ethos and a demonstration of ethos. I feel that one of the contemporary arguments that rages, that you often find yourself significantly and visibly placed on one side of, is the idea that sort of this ethos and these values have become co-opted over time. Now, I know you often talk about how sort of that conservatism versus progressivism is a necessary cultural tension, and you know that many of your detractors and opponents would easily and definitively use the phrase word patriarchy to describe some of these relationships and what they have culturally endowed, and what perhaps they would argue we as men are oblivious to some of the components that are packed into that. What I've come to query is the impossibility of perhaps the equality that it is stated they crave within that framing, i.e. that something that comes from this, forgive the literalism, Genesis would always have to be expressed in this manner, and to create a paradigm that represented a true expression of the divine feminine, it would have to be a different paradigm altogether. This is interesting to me, bearing in mind what you've said earlier about AI being a sort of a conglomerate, an aggregation that could be mapped onto our understanding of a collective unconscious, i.e. archetypes emerge out of patterns observed over time. But what fascinates me also, because I feel it might be practical, for surely as a theology evolves from the Old Testament into the New Testament, is there a sense, without yielding what territory might be inferred to Islam here, if we were to continue the trajectory to the insisted final prophet, that what we are offered in Acts, for example, in the immediate era after Christ's death and resurrection, is that the kind of divinity endowed by the second covenant, God's reversal, inversion and return on Abraham's sacrifice, might become not ubiquitous, but at least accessible to many, that we will perform greater feats than he, that you, my apostles, will perform greater feats, that as he has sent me as his apostle, I send you as my apostles. I read Acts again recently in some easy, accessible, almost slang version of it. In fact, a man who shares your surname, Eugene Peterson's book, The Message, and what I was struck by in this version of Acts was the vivacity, the lividness and vitality of the book, and how the sense of urgency of Christianity, that it, think of the critiques that are often slung in your direction. Conservatism, it's stayed. This is a very sort of, and admittedly it's 2,000 years old, but a very sort of a vibrant call to arms, an urgent sense that, oh my God, we're living in an atrophying and dying ideology. We must become alive with Christ. We must change the world. And even the accounts that are given in there are accounts of people jailed and on trial, that even though it is literally biblical, they're not. It's very distinct from the Old Testament with its locusts and its deserts and its tribes and its manna. Now it sort of feels overtly and literally political. So what I'm saying is that somehow, like, between these two sets of books, and I don't know how arbitrary that taxonomy is even, Jordan, obviously it must be an area of your expertise by now, having sort of watched the incredible content you've generated around it. Has there been a significant reversal of charge? And what is that charge? How are we endowed with that charge now? At the point when you have Richard Dawkins saying, "I am culturally Christian," are people starting to recognize that there is that this is not just a remnant ideology, this is a living thing that has been discarded. I listened to that Bishop Barron who you had on your show the other day talking about ethereal angels, and I thought, yes, the religion that I am interested in is not a precursor and a parallel to psychotherapy. It is a precursor and parallel to quantum physics, helping me to understand, what do you mean when you say self? Who is this self? What do you mean when you say reality? When you say reality, what are you talking about? And is it possible that reality is something that we conjure here as vessels and conduits of the divine, if we have the capacity to somehow in the moment through practice disavow the strong gravitational, literally, pull of the material and the unconscious ethos with which we are continually inculcated by the insidious, nihilistic, albeit glistening culture that attempts to make us all devotees of this new banality.